So hi everybody, I'm Elaine from Cerebra's communications team and welcome to another of our tea break talks where I catch up with colleagues and associates from across the charity just to have a chat about what's new and what's going on in their areas really. And today I'm delighted to be joined by not one, but by three researchers from the new Cerebra Network for Neurodevelopmental Disorders. So welcome to Dr. Haley Crawford, Dr. Caroline Richards, and to Dr. Jo Moss. And thank you so much for joining me today. And we've just announced funding for the new research network for the next 4 years. And some of you may well be familiar with the work that we funded at the University of Birmingham with Professor Chris Oliver. And this new network has grown out of the previous Cerebra Centre for Neurodevelopmental Disorders. So I thought it'd be great today to catch up with everybody who is leading on the new research. So without further ado, I'm going to hand on over to Haley, who's going to tell us a little bit more about her area.
Hi, thanks Elaine. Hi, I'm Dr. Haley Crawford. I'm from Warwick Medical School at the University of Warwick, and I'm going to be leading a programme of work on mental health with Dr. Jane Waite from Aston University, who can't be with us today. So what we're going to be doing is looking at mental health primarily because in this population, children with intellectual disability and rare and complex needs who are minimally verbal can't easily report on their internal experiences. So for example, in the general population, something like anxiety might be identified through clinician rating scales or clinician interviews. And this requires an individual, first of all, to identify that they're feeling anxious, then to label that as anxiety, and then communicate that to somebody else. So for people with an intellectual disability, or many people with an intellectual disability, this isn't an appropriate way to determine that someone's anxious. And instead, we have to look for behavioural markers of anxiety. One of the issues with looking at behavioural markers is that some of these behaviours that might indicate someone is anxious also might indicate a different condition, something like autism. So, for example, social avoidance can be indicative of both autism and social anxiety. And if we're unable to accurately identify that someone is anxious, that then hinders a diagnosis, which then hinders intervention. And we know that for this group of individuals, anxiety and low mood in some people as well is highly prevalent, and it's more common in these individuals than it is in the general population. So it's particularly important for us to understand this more and find better ways to identify it. So as part of the Cerebra Network, Jane and I will be leading some work. First of all, we'll be conducting in-depth surveys with parents and carers of children with genetic syndromes associated with intellectual disability. And this will help us to profile anxiety, to see what this really looks like in these individuals, but also to improve anxiety assessments, including that differentiation of anxiety and autism, where I've mentioned we see that high degree of behavioural overlap. Secondly, we'll be using experimental techniques to identify risk factors for anxiety and other mental health problems. And what this will do is help us to identify other characteristics that place an individual at higher risk for experiencing mental health problems. And then finally, we're planning to develop and pilot an intervention to ameliorate the negative impacts of mental health problems for people with genetic syndromes associated with intellectual disability. So we have this body of work going on into mental health, particularly anxiety, and it's something we're really looking forward to getting going with.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Haley. I hand over to Jo now. Hi, Jo.
Hi Elaine, thanks. So I'm Dr. Jo Moss and I'm a lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Surrey, and I'm going to be leading the work on atypical patterns of autism in rare genetic syndromes associated with intellectual disability. And so we know that the risk for autism or showing autistic characteristics is actually very high across the genetic syndrome population. But identification of autism in clinical settings is comparatively low, and diagnosis often tends to happen quite late in this population as well. Part of the reason for that is that patterns, the presentation of autism in these groups is somewhat atypical. So the characteristics tend to look a little bit different to what we would expect to see in individuals with autism who don't necessarily have a genetic syndrome. And that makes it quite difficult to identify and to recognize some of those characteristics. Secondly, the second reason for this low rate of identification in clinical settings is that, similarly to mentioned by Haley, is that the measurement tools that have been developed are specifically designed to evaluate autism in children who have a non-syndromal presentation of autism, and so they're not necessarily that sensitive at picking up these slightly atypical characteristics and presentations that we tend to see. And so the work that we're going to be carrying out in Surrey is going to be focusing on two specific aspects. So one, we're going to be thinking about some of the causes of this atypical profile, so why we see these atypical presentations in genetic syndromes. And through that work, we're going to be developing a new battery of assessments that is very widely accessible across ages and abilities. So we're going to be using eye tracking technology that requires very limited or minimal verbal input and allows us to really characterize some of these challenges across a wider range of individuals and be a bit more inclusive, perhaps, than we've been able to before. And secondly, we're going to be thinking a bit more about the sort of standard measurement tools that are typically used to identify autism in individuals, and to think about the sensitivity and validity of those measures in individuals with rare genetic syndromes. And that's really with a view to thinking about clinical outcomes. So we want to know really what is happening to these individuals. Do they receive a diagnosis in a clinical setting? Are they accessing the right sort of level of support that they need? And really trying to understand a bit more about the clinical outcomes for individuals who show these high rates of autistic characteristics.
Brilliant, thank you, Jo, for that. And then can I finally hand over to Caroline? Hi, Caroline.
Hi, Elaine. Yeah, so I'm Dr. Caroline Richards. I'm a senior lecturer and clinical psychologist based in the School of Psychology at the University of Birmingham. And I'll be leading one of the final strands of work that we'll be conducting as a network, looking at sleep difficulties. So we know in children in general, sleep can be a particular challenge. But in typically developing children, problems with getting to sleep at night, staying asleep, getting up too early, these tend to shift as children develop and mature. What we know from the relatively limited research in children who have rare and complex needs is that sleep difficulties tend to be much more common, but they also tend to be more persistent. Now, this is really problematic because we now know that sleep affects every single aspect of our daytime. So it affects our mood, our well-being, our behaviour, our physiological characteristics, how quickly we heal after an accident, our academic attainment in school. It has these huge widespread effects, and yet we know the least about sleep in the children for whom sleep problems are most common. So the major theme of the sleep work we'll be leading is to better understand sleep in children with rare and complex needs. Historically, a lot of the research that's gone on in this area has relied on parent reports, so parents explaining to researchers how many times their child woke up, how long for. Asking sleep-deprived parents to do this with a degree of accuracy is really problematic and often overburdensome to families. So we're moving to a new measurement approach, which is using wearable wrist-worn sleep trackers. And that theme of improved measurement is persistent across all aspects of what we're doing as a network. We recognise that the clinical needs of children with rare and complex presentations are often understudied, and the tools we have to study them are often poorer than for their typically developing counterparts. So we want to apply this better technique to look at sleep in children with rare syndromes. And then we want to look at how, once we characterise their sleep more precisely, how it might affect their daytime. So if they have a good night's sleep, do we see that their mood, their behaviour, their sociability is different during the day? And we can then draw on some of the work that Haley and Jane and Joe are doing to look at those daytime impacts. And then in a second stream of work, we want to ask the question, what about if we didn't wait until children have a sleep difficulty? What about if we delivered some interventions before any problems with sleep emerge? So we're going to be looking in a small group of children with rare and complex needs at whether early intervention could make a difference to children's sleep trajectories.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that. And I know today we've literally just given a very brief summary and scratched the surface of the work that you're going to be doing. So it would be really lovely to keep in touch with you all as the projects unfold, and let people know, how it's going, and what you're finding and the impact that you're making, because to me it just sounds such an exciting body of research, and one that's going to make such a huge difference to the lives of children and their families. So thank you all very much. There is some information on our website, on the Cerebra website, about the network and the research that they'll be undertaking, if you want to log in and have a look at that. But just to say thanks once again, and exciting times, and good luck with it all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.